So hi and welcome and thank you for joining us for our Workday Chats today. I'm Chris Wada, your host for today's discussion. If you have any questions, please share them in the comments below. And today I'm joined by Hyoun Park. He's the CEO and Principal Analyst at Amalgam Insights. And we're here today to talk about ESG, environmental, social, and governance, as it relates to how you run your business. And the events over the past 2 years, it's really made this imperative more pressing than ever for businesses around the globe. We're looking forward to exploring best practices with you today to really help others elevate their policies and measure progress. So really great to have you here and looking forward to the discussion, Hyoun.
Yeah, it's my pleasure.
Great. So why don't we get into it? We got a lot to cover today. I think the first question that's on top of people's minds is really which key areas are businesses focusing on as they look to operationalize ESG and deliver on their key goals?
Yeah, so environmental, social, governance, that's a whole big, hairy challenge for businesses to handle, especially since ESG is important because it is an attempt to quantify each of these areas that has traditionally been very qualitative. A lot of work has been put over the past year or two, especially on the environmental side, understanding your footprint associated with utilities, associated with being greener, being able to have those green credits, being able to avoid toxic materials. And so being able to quantify that and have dollar amounts or at least quantitative fines associated with non-compliance in that environmental space has really been a focus in this immediate past couple of years. But I would say that in addition to that, that the environmental challenge has been challenging because we have had these massive supply chain issues over the past couple of years. We've all noticed it. At the beginning of the pandemic, we all rushed to get toilet paper or what have you, because all these things were missing. We're starting to run into some higher level challenges a lot around processors and computing, which is actually keeping semiconductor industry, computer industry, mobile device industry from being able to fully provide supply for all of their devices. If you look at the IBMs and the HPEs of the world, they're actually saying we want to provide more servers, more computing, same with Amazon, Google, etc. But they can't do it because they're having trouble getting the rare earth materials, the magnets, the noble gases needed to be able to etch semiconductors. So we're starting to see reuse happening there from an environmental perspective as well. And then we're starting to see, in addition, the environmental issue coming up as a brand issue, a sourcing issue, sustainability issue. I mean, we could go on and on, but I would say that of these three areas, that environmental area is one where a lot of advances have been made over the past couple of years, whereas I would say with social and aspects of improving governance, still kind of a work in progress. I think these are things that obviously companies should care about, and there are strategic reasons to care about each of these areas. But in terms of quantifying these areas, there's still some work to be done. And frankly, I think there are going to be some upcoming capabilities that make social and governance easier to quantify over time.
Yeah, and that's true, because we talk to a lot of suppliers, a lot of companies out there. Your point about the environmental, a lot of folks are talking about how do you drive sustainability efforts forward and reducing the effects of climate change. How do you really set your targets, moving to net zero? Really big focus point, and really understanding how to get there. On the governance side, your point about like transparency, that is huge. It's key. How do you actually make sure that you are meeting your obligations? Are you compliant? And how do you disclose that to everybody you work with? And the social aspect, we're seeing that firsthand as well. It's just how do you hire, develop talent for underrepresented backgrounds? How do you nurture that culture of belonging? It's big top of mind for a lot of the companies we're talking to.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of moves me to the next question that a lot of folks have is really around how do you do it? And that's things like what best practices can organizations implement to improve their reporting and how do you give them that guidance?
Yeah, so I think each of these challenges is honestly a separate challenge. I think of the interesting thing I saw around sustainability is that McKinsey says that 2/3 of sustainability and environmental issues come back to sourcing, whether it be fossil fuels, logistics, computing, all of the challenges associated with the materials and services that are used to create the product. This is really a huge sourcing issue. So frankly, any organization that does not link sourcing to sustainability is not going to be successful in quantifying their efforts here, because at the end of the day, what you bring into the company, it always goes through sourcing, and sourcing has to have some sort of measure of what is coming in, what is green, starting to think about, I'm not going to say that we're quite there, but ideally getting to kind of an environmental bill of materials, of understanding what kind of efforts and what kinds of materials actually go into creating your unit of X, whatever it is from a product or service perspective that creates revenue.
Yeah, and that's true, because we've seen a lot of customers really start to invest in strategic sourcing technologies. We obviously provide that, but a lot of the questions that we talk through with our customers are around how do they align closely with their suppliers on this. To your point about sourcing, when we're sourcing from suppliers, how do we know that they're following these policies? And a large part of what we see our customers deal with are really, they need to set their policies clearly internally to make sure that whatever they're looking for, it is measurable, it's understood, it's transparent. And so how do you educate your stakeholders on that? And then what we hear often is how do we collect data on this? It has to be a trusted source, and we don't want to look from it from many different sources. We want one unified way to do that, to really assess your supplier risk, your diversity, and your metrics. It's all got to come from one place.
Right, because all of that is ultimately a brand promise that companies make. Right. If you are a trusted provider, people trust that, for instance, 0% of your stuff is coming from, say, child labor, obviously a horrible thing. You don't want your brand associated with that. You don't want to be associated with shutting out populations of people associated with your workforce or your partners or your contractors or your customer base. All these things where to actually make your brand promise real, you've got to be able to see what's going on here and make sure that across each of these areas, you are living up to your corporate promises, your brand promises, and frankly, the long-term vision that drives equity and stock value.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen a lot of customers too. Everybody has their own definition of this too. And we always are talking through, we need that additional flexibility. We need to make sure we can configure things the way we view the world, and the way we want to make sure we can capture that from our stakeholders, suppliers, have that flexibility to do it, because everybody has slightly their own interpretation of it. But it's definitely something that we're trying to find the middle ground between consistency, but still recognize that everybody's a little bit different there.
Right. And one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is kind of sustainability as part of the long-term business goal of as a long-term business goal. When you look at the Fortune 500 or S&P 500, companies are spending less and less time at those highest levels before being purchased, going out of business. We are at a very volatile time in business as things happen faster. There are no 20-year platforms anymore. Everything is 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, your 3-month mobile app to solve one specific challenge. And as you're dealing with all of that, on the one hand, you have to deliver faster, but at the same time, you have to have sustainable and long-term strategies to maintain your business, or else you will be going so quickly in towards these short-term goals that you're not going to maintain long-term success. So sustainability ends up being a very important piece of that puzzle, and it's something that increasingly customers, investors, and other stakeholders are looking at.
Yeah, and you touched on that 20-year platform thing. I think a lot of what we're seeing is that the number of suppliers that people can work with is just much larger than it used to be. And from that, you definitely get a lot of pressure to figure out how do you compare suppliers and how do you do it in an efficient way, and make sure that I understand, that they meet the criteria that I need to make. And I think there's this, overarching theme that we see is people feel like it's limiting their supplier choice.
Mm-hmm.
There's some resistance on saying that if we have to meet all this criteria, then we're not going to be able to look broadly enough. And we think that absolutely over time, especially over the last couple of years and the spotlight that's been on it, we feel very strongly that that'll diminish and the supply base will continue to broaden.
Yeah, if anything, the challenge is kind of in the other direction. We talk about big data, and from a practical perspective, there are millions of companies out there that can potentially be providers for whatever you want out there. We're in a global economy, many companies that can provide services, maybe 5, 10 people, 10 people, 20 people, 50 people. And then you need all of the aforementioned documentation and governance associated with each supplier, which small businesses can do that too, but you need just as much information on the small businesses that you may already have for, say, the GEs of the world that are already big and know how to fill out the paperwork.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we'll switch gears a little bit and let's talk about the power of partnership. I think a lot of folks and a lot of customers, this is very early on in their journey, right? And so a lot of the times they're looking for folks who are doing the same thing as them. What tips can you share around with our audience around successful collaboration on ESG initiatives?
Yeah, so collaboration in each of these areas is important. Being able to work with your suppliers on a shared vision and definition of what is a credit, what are we trying to quantify in terms of potential damage to the environment, and the actual cash amount associated with any sort of issue that happens here. Having that shared, frankly, dollar amount or euro amount at the end of the day is going to be an important starting point. Moving a little bit to the social side, which we haven't quite talked as much about yet, having an idea of how your current workforce exists from a recruiting perspective, from an executive perspective, from a training perspective, how that reflects the communities that you're currently in, as well as your customer base. Being able to have those metrics in place, and then being able to work with those communities that in question to be able to make sure that your workforce is moving towards the distributions that exist in these other communities is an important piece of the puzzle. So getting those metrics in place and being able to actually have evidence of what is happening there. And then from a governance perspective, looking at the metrics that actually support goodwill. And I don't mean that in a vague sense. I mean that as the actual line item that exists in your annual report as an asset. Looking at this from a business perspective, and then making sure that you have goals that are aimed towards those goodwill concerns that are relevant to your market and to your specific company are important. At the end of the day, ESG is not just, it's not window dressing. It is an important tool to be able to increase the value of your company, to increase the assets of your organization, and to lead to an environment where you're delivering, again, on that brand promise and creating a stronger company as a result. This isn't charity, this is business.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point around how even in this discussion, we didn't initially talk a lot about the social aspect. It's a lot for every company to look at all three at the same time. And I think for us, we've seen a lot of companies who talk through how to prioritize that. And some people are closer to one than the other aspect, at least for the next 12 months. And so a lot of what we see is around prioritization of making sure that, maybe for this year, we're going to focus solely on the social aspect. And we think that we're closest to that. And then really, as a company, really focus on the environmental side and really come to an agreement on how to move the needles there. Because I think even internally, a lot of people don't know how to contribute to these initiatives. You have different folks from R&D, you have people who are directly in supply chain. Everybody has their part in it. And I think that alignment internally is always good. And then even in your industry, to know who your partners are out there. And a lot of folks do know who their partners on and where are they at in their initiatives. How are they driving their journeys? Is there anything that I can learn from them and vice versa? And together they can really make that a standard across the board.
Yeah, and so much of this frankly comes down to what I'll call either internal politics or stakeholders. Having executive stakeholders obviously matters. I'm going to take a somewhat controversial view here that I think that this needs to be tied to an officer who is established in the company. I think sometimes companies try to get a chief sustainability officer or chief diversity officer thinking that will solve the problem. It can if that person has executive power and is truly strategic. But at the same time, as we spoke about before, the environmental issue is often a sourcing issue. Maybe that's something that the chief procurement officer should take a hands-on approach in starting. On the social side, obviously, chief talent officer, chief HR officer is in a good situation to be able to help with that type of work. A chief strategy officer might be positioned well to be able to put these pieces together, possibly the CFO, the strategic CFO. But I think the people involved in this have to be at a high level and with strategic understanding of how each of these areas affect the company, rather than having this be simply compliance hire or somebody put in to magically solve a problem without being a part of the core executive team.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think your call out on chief procurement officer, we hear that a lot, that they're actually in that position to not just drive change internally, but when they set that bar with suppliers and suppliers don't get that business, it becomes much bigger than their internal goals. They're losing business because buyers don't want to work with them anymore because of that. And I think chief procurement officers definitely can drive a lot of that piece, and we are starting to see some of that change. And I know we've covered a lot of topics, but I think folks would probably be interested on what is your top prediction for the future of ESG?
So one of the things that I think is really missing right now is understanding the social aspects of what is happening from a metric perspective. So this includes recruiting, talent, representation, and also sourcing opportunities, dealing with those tier twos, dealing with diversity sourcing, or sourcing in the geographic area of, or in that level of expertise that may exist, rather than simply farming out sourcing to a high-level aggregator of services or aggregator of materials. And so I think there's going to be this increase. At some point, we're going to get to an area of having kind of a social bill of materials where we can actually look at the diversity that is involved in creating our everything from a labor and resources perspective. We're not quite there yet. We're a little ahead of that in sourcing compared to talent and HR in terms of having these guidelines and metrics that provide some sort of gold standard. But I think that's the next big step for ESG in terms of being able to provide metrics and goals that are meaningful for the enterprise. And it's going to happen because at the end of the day, customers, clients, investors want some sort of guidance on what is actually good and what is actually and a commitment made towards ESG that we can actually look at.
Yeah, and I think kind of to go back to my point earlier, I think a lot of the initiatives will align with suppliers, and I think they will have a huge seat at the table to make a big impact on ESG performance. You know, I think they'll be tracking a lot. Sourcing teams will be tracking a lot around diversity, you know, water usage, CO2 emissions, really everything that will touch on all aspects of how close are they to making sure they're following the right governance. Are they socially, their brand is what we represent, and then on the environmental, are they doing it and producing a product in a way that's sustainable? And again, you know, kind of going back to it, I think they sit at that core, and they will be able to drive, you know, a huge impact in that area. And you know, I think one thing that we're excited is that, you know, we have been working on stuff like that, a package solution to really try to drive and standardize that across our customer base. And we're leveraging, you know, everything within our financials application, our Prism Analytics, and strategic sourcing to really automate the collection of that data of ESG risk data with suppliers, identifications of areas for improvement. And again, going back to reporting, did we do what we said we were going to do? How are we tracking on that? We understand that's not going to happen overnight, but how can we show internally the progress that we're making, and people feel good about the direction we're going?
Yeah, and I think just from a practical perspective, it's traditionally been difficult to bring the financial and sourcing aspects of sustainability together, because on the one hand, you're forecasting and budgeting what you think you're going to have in terms of CO2 credits, renewable energy. Sure, you can do that from the financial side. And then on the other side, on the sourcing, you have an idea of who you're going to be using and how that fits in. But getting the two to work together has been challenging, and that makes it difficult to actually execute on ESG at a level that frankly is starting to become required with the increasing level of regulation that is happening here.
Yeah, and I think everybody has to kind of take that mentality that it's got to start somewhere. Why not us? And to your point around measuring it and showing progress, it's gotta come like one step at a time. But the important thing is that people do start and move towards it, because I think your point around it starting to become required, it's going to have to move.
Right. But at the same time, you don't want to be, say, purchasing credits that are then being used perhaps for as a way of getting around environmental concerns. You want to have that supply chain lineage in place to be able to understand that as well, because you can be caught unawares if you don't understand where these credits are coming from, where they're going. For instance, if you're selling all of your sustainability credits to perhaps a gas company that then fracks and causes an environmental accident, your brand starts becoming directly impacted by that, and not necessarily because of anything, any harmful intention, but simply not being able to track where everything started from and where everything ended up. So that lineage and planning and sourcing coming together is going to be important here, just because that the economic and the planning issues need to be a part of this puzzle.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Great point. So Hyoun, I know we're actually probably more up at time, but I really want to just thank you for sharing your insights and joining me today. Really appreciate your time. I learned a lot from you. I'm sure the folks who are watching definitely learned a lot as well. To the folks who are watching, thank you for joining us, and really please come back and join our next episode of Workday Chats. So thank you, everybody.
Thanks.